Okay, hi everyone. I think people will be joining as we talk, but I guess we can start. Maybe we should wait a couple of minutes
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah.
just to see. Oh, we can start with introductions anyway. There's a nice long list of introductions. So, hi everyone. Good evening. Welcome to this event by Champaca and HarperCollins with Gautam Bhatia, the author of The Wall. I'm Nirica, and I work at Champaca. Champaca is an independent women-run bookstore, children's library, and cafe. We bring diverse stories and perspectives for our readers and in our children's library through our books and events. We also have an online store that ships across India, and you can find all the books on our shelves on our website. Gautam Bhatia is a science fiction writer, reviewer, and editor with the award-winning Strange Horizons magazine. The Wall is his debut novel and the first book in a duology. He would like you to know that his day job in a black gown and a band has as much place in the wall as a Kindle in a bookshop. That is none at all. The Wall is set in Sumer, a place without a horizon, a city bound by a wall that encloses it entirely. The novel follows Mithila and her friends as they search for meaning. Who built the wall? Why does it exist? And can they imagine a world without it? The book is available at Champaca and on our online store. I'll put the link in the chat box. You can pick up your copy. And if at any point anyone has any questions, you can send them into the chat box or the Q&A box at the bottom. So, hi Gautam, it's so nice
Hi.
to be doing an event with you.
As I remember being in Champaca and being struck by the very defined science fiction shelf there. So so it's lovely to be here, and thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's nice to speak with you again because we did our last event with you this year. So lots has changed since then. So let's just dive right into it. So do you want to start by sort of talking about the process of world building in the Wall, because it is set in a sort of closed city, completely enclosed. So how did you go about thinking of how to sort out resources, how to set up that system? If you could just take us through that process.
I'll start with an example that I think will help to maybe illustrate some of the challenges and even also some of the fun part of it as well. I was chatting once with someone who was kind of really closely involved in shaping the book, and suddenly out of the blue once she said, "Where are the bees?" In the city, and I mean, part of the plot is that there is no fauna in the city, right? So I realized that there are no bees in the city, but that had like a serious knock-on effect, because that would then mean that the only crops, the only form of flora itself would have to be self-pollinating essentially. And that would rule out vast species of flora could not be there, and that would have an impact on the kinds of clothes that people could wear, the kind of food they could eat, and even something like blue being the status symbol and coming from the woad flower, which is an important part of the novel, that the woad flower is self-pollinating. So I had to basically build an entire city with only self-pollinating flora, because of the fact that the plot required there to be no animals and no bees specifically. So something as basic as that then just kind of constrained the entire range of options that were open, and made like world building this very complex process that also required like a lot of research into what would be possible. And if you really wanted to have this kind of semi-closed, self-sustaining system, what are the constraints that you would have to adhere to? So self-pollinating flowers was one. The second was, for example, that something like iron, right? If you want to have iron, then it has to be renewable, because if it exhausts, then there's no iron left. So for a long time, I thought that the city would have to be effectively living in the Stone Age. And even the stones are gone, right? So even something even less than that, because there's no iron and the stone is exhausted. So you basically only have wood. But then I found that bog iron actually is found in swamps and is renewable. So then the city had to obviously have a swamp. So I put a swamp in the city. The problem then was that bog iron is really a brittle form of iron, and it breaks very easily. And then I found that the Vikings accidentally discovered that if you mix bone into bog iron, it actually becomes an alloy and becomes much stronger. And so the Vikings used to alloy iron with bone and use that to make bog iron very strong. And thankfully, bone is of course something that exists in the city. And so then that's so I could actually have a city where you could have strong iron implements, iron weapons. And so at every step there were all these challenges. Okay, like how do you manage to build this closed system that nonetheless allows its citizens to live a certain kind of life that is not extremely in the pre-Iron Age times. And so it was challenging, and each time you solved something, it was very thrilling. Okay, so they can have iron because you can have iron in bone and it's renewable. They can have clothes because self-pollinating plants and so on. So ultimately you were able to build this kind of closed city which could work and actually work without taking recourse to magic. So in some things, of course, yes. So the water where the water comes from is something not yet revealed, and that is it is clearly something that is not that wouldn't exist within the science that we know. So there were a couple of get out clauses I put for myself, but for the most part, it was a challenge in building this without taking recourse to magic or what Indra Das calls science fantasy. So it was a lot of fun, very challenging, but really just the every time I discovered something and it made it possible, it was a great high.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. How much of the process of writing the book was just building the world?
It took a lot of time. Took a lot of research. There's also a wonderful online forum called World Building Stack, where over the last 10 years, people have asked every question you can imagine with respect to building worlds. And many of the questions I had, for example, at what rate should water evaporate so that the level of water remains constant, was a question somebody else had asked 5 years ago, and it had been answered by scientists. So many questions I had. I also had a question about what must be the ratio of farmland to population to sustain a certain amount of population given a certain amount of acreage of farmland. Also been asked on that Substack, been answered by a nutritionist, food expert. So I was helped with the fact that people are always building worlds. That's the beauty about science fiction. People are always building worlds. People always have these questions, and the biggest science fiction geeks, right, are people who belong to a vast variety of professions. And so whatever question you have, there would be a science fiction geek who's like a mountaineer, or like a nutritionist or an architect who would have an answer for it. And so that was also quite amazing.
Oh, that's really cool. The other thing, I mean, aside from the physical sort of setting up of the world, the other thing that struck me is that all of the physical space impacts how the social structure works, right?
Yeah.
So the thing that struck me, and I'm sure struck most readers, is what paralleled real world systems and what didn't. So you do see this sort of class and caste divisions, or something that parallels caste and class divisions. But what struck me when I read it is that you don't see homophobia. So the main character Mithila is in a relationship with a woman, and that absence of homophobia doesn't parallel a real world system. So how did you go about structuring those parts of the book?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question. So and really one of the lines that has stuck by me for a long time is something Ursula Le Guin used to say. She said that the task of science fiction writers is to imagine alternatives to the way in which we live. And so for me, and one thing I've always found annoying is that you have these science fiction novels and fantasy novels that have great imagination, great scope, great breadth and depth, but somehow they're still stuck with empires, still stuck with worlds in which are patriarchal, misogynistic, homophobic, right? It's just it's as if you can imagine so much, but you're still stuck with the social structures that you inhabit in your own world. And of course, there are exceptions to that rule, and exceptions are notable. So that was my first thing. If you have the freedom, and this genre, unlike litfic, gives you the freedom to do that, why would you replicate in your imagined world the same prejudices that exist in the world in which you live in? So that was the first thing. So I thought that and given that you have I'm building a world in which many of the material conditions that give rise to something like homophobia or patriarchy don't actually exist. Like there's no question of traveling long distances, or something like pregnancy can actually affect the way your mobility and then give rise to this kind of division of gender roles and so on. Given that those material conditions did not exist, I was free to imagine a plausible, non-misogynistic, non-patriarchal, and non-homophobic world, and so then thought it makes sense to do that. And so that was the first kind of point of departure. That given a choice, why not imagine a world that is non-patriarchal and non-homophobic? So that was the first thing. The second was, at the same time, it does seem to be a feature of human societies that wherever you have scarce resources, there exists a kind of social division about how to distribute, and there is conflict about how to distribute those resources. In our world, we don't really have scarce resources, but there is a myth of scarcity that capitalism and neoliberalism feeds to us, and then uses that to justify inequalities. And so I thought that if you actually had, physically scarce resources, which were exhaustible, then there definitely would be conflict over the manner in which you decide how they get distributed and how they get, produced, and who produces them, who has power over them. So that then did remain a point of conflict, and that gave rise to the kinds of class hierarchies that you see in the city, and of course the attempts by people to, contest them, because wherever in history we've had hierarchies, we've had those who want to, contest them. So that's why non-patriarchal, non-homophobic, but nonetheless class-based. There was thinking behind that.
Right. I mean, like with the world building, there's just so much thought in this book. When I was planning this talk, I think I had just so many questions to ask, because there's so much in this book to talk about. The other thing that I think I've talked to you about earlier as well is that it's expansive in a different way as well, because you introduce us to so many different characters and so many groups of different people. And the thing that struck me while I was reading it is that also in the book, each of those groups of people is sort of, let's say, fighting for a certain thing. And all of them, you managed to give all of them sort of concrete arguments and credibility to their arguments. So how did you go about doing that? Because that's quite a task.
Yeah, I think there's also it was a fundamental. So I think one of the things that has also annoyed me about, fantasy and science fiction in general, has been that the overarching framework has always been about heroes and villains and saving the world. Now, within that framework, you have complex and flawed characters. I'm not saying that you always have Mary Sue's, as they say in fantasy, perfect heroes and villains. So there's a lot of fantastic complexity within the framework. But the overall framework, a lot of times, and I think too many times, is still that you are very clear as a reader whose side you're meant to be on. There is no doubt about that. And I felt that the actual world is not always that easy or that clean cut. It's much messier. And wherever you have stakes, it's not immediately obvious, what side you should be on. Sometimes there is, but not always. And so for me, again, it was important to underscore that that you're dealing with a messy world in which it's not clear what the right thing is and even what the good thing is. You're dealing also with bounded knowledge, and you have to make decisions often in the dark. And so again, there's a question of what is right and what is wrong is not an easy one to answer. And so therefore, it became important that while the protagonist exists and it's clear who the protagonist is, and her kind of cause is also, it's clear in an ethical and moral sense why she's motivated and what she wants to do. Her opponents are not caricatures, and they are arguing themselves in good faith about what they believe, is the right thing. And that I think often structures a lot of real world conflicts as well. And so in that sense, I wanted to ensure that at the end of it, there should be some doubt about who was actually right and who wasn't, and what side ultimately, the reader should be on. Of course, I have my own biases, but I think it's the author's task is to ensure that is to ensure that you set up the question for the reader, but you don't answer it for the reader. That's the reader's job to see what answer they think is the best one. But your job is to, I think, outline the question in a way that hasn't been done before and is thought provoking in certain ways, and and triggers thoughts about what was right or what was wrong, but not just stuff the answer down the reader's throats.
That makes sense. So with that, like, I think that actually, do you want to just introduce us to some of the groups of characters in the novel? Just
Yeah, sure.
context?
So there's obviously the protagonist is called Mithila, and she is determined to find a way beyond the wall because again, like and I think one thing I want to do was that in history many times revolutions are triggered by extreme material deprivation. So if you look at the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, uh, they're often triggered by the fact that the situation of the people in material terms was so bad that there was just no other way out but this kind of violent upheaval that would fundamentally alter social structures. And of course, where it went is a different matter, but that was what triggered it. Um, so I didn't want that to be the case because again, that's an easy way out. If you depict great oppression, great suffering, and then say, oh look, people want to change that, that's just an easy way out. So the first, I think, question for me was that in a world in which there is no great deprivation, where everyone is reasonably well taken care of, there are of course hierarchies and class interests and so on, but there is a basic threshold level of a reasonably comfortable and dignified life that everyone has access to. And so in that case, if someone wants to radically change things, what might motivate them, and would abstract ideas be enough? So in this case, you have this whole sense of the fact that the wall is a physical barrier that shuts off experiences. It constrains the language that you have to make sense of the world, because you have a word called the horizon, but you have no way to imagine what the horizon actually is. And the only reason why you have the word is because in an old book, that word is there, but you still can't connect it to an actual image. And so you're basically living not a physically impoverished life, but an impoverished life in a different sense. And that is enough to drive some people, to want to change that radically and completely alter that, but not everyone. So the motivations of the protagonists are basically wanting to alter that. You also then have, a priesthood that is committed to maintaining the existence of the wall. But again, it's not that they're fundamentalists. Although, of course, you obviously always have to have a kind of a myth or an origin myth or a story to justify something like this. But if you go behind that, the arguments are a little more complex. And it is that if life is stagnant but reasonably comfortable, and if the possibilities of it changing could either mean that they change for the better or for substantially worse, then is that enough reason to want that change or not? So that is the arguments that they advance to maintain the existence of something like this physical barrier. And of course, you have the governors of the city. And I should again stress, it's not a theocracy. And I've seen that interpretation given a couple of times. It's not a theocracy. The religious group has power like they do in any society, but they don't rule the city. And the actual governors are, of course, as the governors always are, completely concerned with maintaining order, and ensuring that nothing disrupts things too much. So they always want to make sure that there is nobody who is, in a position where an upheaval can come and, cause those kinds of problems. So their motivations are governed by maintaining stability, whatever that might require of them in any given situation. So I mean, these are broadly the three main groups. And of course, there are scientists also who don't feature too much in this book, but they will a little more in the next one. That I can promise you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, actually,
Yeah.
with that, so a lot of the different groups, a lot of the arguments hinge on like either, yeah, like you mentioned, sort of constructing this origin story or constructing some kind of like interpretation of history. And with that, I think you talk a lot in this book about like the weight or the importance given to oral versus written narratives. So
Yeah.
yeah, if you want to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I was so few years ago I read this really amazing book called The Singer of Tales, and it was about these two Harvard scholars who went to Serbia because they wanted to find out the origins of the Iliad, and what troubled them was that look, the Iliad is the pinnacle of epic lyric epic poetry from Greece, and also apparently the first of its kind. And in the development of any genre, you never have the pinnacle and the first being the same, because starting off in a new genre, you make mistakes, you fumble, and the genre gradually comes to a point where it reaches its peak, right? So it can't be that the Iliad was both the first epic poem and also the best ever written in that time. So their hunch was that actually the Iliad was never originally written. It was in oral form, and Homer wasn't a person. Like, there were many bards who had many performances of the Iliad, until at one point it was reduced to writing. So they and in Serbia you had the last kind of remnants in Europe of the oral epic tradition still existing. So they basically went to Serbia and kind of recorded those oral epics, and then kind of had a thesis where they argued that actually the Iliad began as an oral epic. And so, in fact, for example, in the famous catalog of ships in the Iliad book 2, nobody can get through that, right? Because it's just like a whole bunch of ships, bunch of people, and a bunch of like locations. And I don't know if anybody will actually manage to like survive that book 2. Everyone skims over it. The reason why it's there is because the audience, the oral audience, would have known exactly who the people were, what the ships were, and what those places were. So for them, it made sense. It doesn't make sense to us now, 2,000 years later. The Aeneid, which was actually written, doesn't have anything of that kind, which shows you the distinction between the Aeneid and the Iliad. So there was this book, The Singer of Tales, draws these really amazing and interesting distinctions between how in the oral poetic form there is no one original version. There are only different performances, and each performance is there's no idea of the original. Each performance is original. The story is retold and adapted depending upon the audience in any given time, and there's no concept of there being like the original that you then depart from or don't depart from. In India, you have another great book called The Festival of Parting, which dealt with the oral poetry in Rajasthan, which does something very similar. So that really started me off on this distinction between oral and written poetry. I then read a fictionalized version of this story, which is among I think my favorite books. It's called The File on H by Ismail Kadare, this legendary Albanian writer, and he basically fictionalizes this, and he has these two like presumptuous Harvard scholars who go to Albania with the same like motivations. And Kadare being Kadare, in all his books, you have all these plays on the links between poetry, nationalism, the idea of the nation state, and so on. So what happens in his book is that the people living there, they believe that if you are bringing a recorder to kind of record their oral epics, you're trying to actually cage or kill the oral tradition, because now the moment you record, you will have like one version which is the original, and you will no longer have the idea of there being many equally authentic variations on no single theme. And so that leads to a lot of like conflict in the book, which is like it's put. I don't want to give spoilers, but it's really very moving and very haunting. And so you have this conflict where on the one hand, if you want to preserve something, it would seem that a record that is unchangeable is necessary. On the other hand, just by doing that, you are destroying the whole purpose of a tradition which is based on there not being an original, authentic version. And there seems to be no answer to that conflict in any real way. And so a lot of the ideas were modeled on that, because I felt that this would play out specifically in a city which is circular, where the circle plays an important role. And if you think of time as being circular and things coming back to where they are, which again has been an important part of pre-capitalist societies, the idea of time being linear is something that arose with capitalism. It didn't really exist as a concept before that. You would have conflicts over whether you should have an oral pass that is dominant view, or whether you should have a written pass that then allows you to treat time as linear and moving forward along with it. So I adapted the conflict a little bit to this situation, and again I tried to give both sides like reasonably good arguments, until like one side does things which I wouldn't go into. But again, the idea was that this whole conflict between the oral and the written, the original and the many, is something that really structures our lives without us even knowing it. We are all of a written culture, but it was certain kind of conflict that brought us to a point where we have internalized the written culture as something that's natural. That need not be the case.
Okay. Speaking of something structuring the world that we see, and this is a big thing in science fiction, you've already mentioned it, this specific example that I'm going to bring up, which is how language plays such a role in sort of shaping the world that they see in the wall. And you mentioned the horizon, and that image is obviously one of the most striking to me in the wall, when Mithila tries to get a group of people to imagine a horizon, which is something that they'd never seen or heard of. So I know that that's like generally a trope that I like a lot in science fiction, but do you want to talk about just language and how you thought of it, both expanding and limiting our experience of the world?
Yeah, so again, I'm going to unfortunately go back to the Iliad. There's a phrase in the Iliad called the wine dark sea, which is a very famous phrase, and there's this whole debate over whatever the color of the sea is, it's not the color of wine.
Yeah.
So where is the wine dark sea coming from? In a wonderful book called The Language Game by I think it's Guy Dusher is the author's name. Sorry, not language. Sorry, it's called Through the Language Glass, not the Language Game. That's something else. Through the Language Glass, by this guy called I think it's either Guy Dusher or Isaac Dusher. I can't remember, but yeah, that's the name of the book. He explores the idea of the wine dark sea, and what he shows is that while colors are natural in the sense that they occur in nature, the color spectrum is human made, and so violet, indigo, blue, green, yellow, orange, and red is a spectrum that we have invented to map onto what the real world colors are. The Greeks had a completely different color spectrum, where if you look at that spectrum, actually the color of the sea and the color of wine were within the same group. So actually, what we think of as green is not one color, right? Like it's a whole. The green is a spectrum itself on a larger spectrum. So on the Greek spectrum, the color of wine and the color of the sea were defined in the same band as we now define, say, for example, green. And so then you had this whole thing of how the language that you've chosen, which is a human creation, and the way it interacts with reality shapes the way you see what the world is. And that, of course, has been explored in different ways of seeing. It is a very different cultural critique, of course, not the same thing, but again, this whole sense of this interaction between how you perceive the world, language that you have for it, and what's actually there. In science fiction, you have amazing stuff on that. Samuel Delany, Babel 17, the early explorations of that trope, and the theory that he was basing it on, the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, is now discredited. But and that's kind of that thesis basically has this hard relationship between language and the world. It says that language creates the world, and that nobody agrees with anymore. That's too strong a claim. More recently, China Miéville's Embassy Town, has a species that does not know how to lie. Like, they literally cannot lie. And that is used by human beings to kind of colonize them, and then the story is about how they discover the ability to lie and therefore take on human beings once more in kind of decolonial violence. So science fiction is again a great place where the relationship between between language and the world is, explored. And what I wanted to again explore was that when you have a physical barrier that limits your experiences, the range of your experiences physically, then your language would both reflect that and also invariably entrench that. So to start with, you don't have words for many of the things because you've never experienced them. And you never can have the words because you don't know what those experiences are like. So in that sense, your language in its narrowness reflects, that. And similarly, when you do get a word, then you struggle to imagine what it might be because there is no experience you can map onto that. And so part of the premise of the book is the attempts people make to overcome, that barrier through an act of imagination. And I think it's possible, and that's what I try to kind of maybe show in the book at various times. It is possible to overcome it, but it's hard. And also, like, it really affects the way at a meta level writing as well, because again, I was just I'm working on the sequel right now, and so I had this point at which a character like goes still, and person I'm working with, she put the word froze over there, like so and so froze. So, like, I can't use the word because there's no concept of like freezing, in the city. So so I can't use the word froze anywhere in the novel. So in that sense, like it also curtails my choice of words because the world itself is the curtailed one. That's also like part of the fun again, is to still write reasonably well with these constraints.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like a lot of this is just a really interesting thought experiment, like both within the book with this imagine a horizon and your experience of writing the book.
Yeah, and I think like the best science fiction has always been that you change a couple of things about the world that you think are so familiar, and then see what happens. I mean, Isaac Asimov's Nightfall, and Asimov, I recently found out, sexual harasser, and so acknowledging that that fact, that novel is I think an example of this, where you have a civilization where there's six suns, and so there's never nightfall except for once in 2,500 years, and so something as internalized as the night and the stars, if that wasn't part of our world, how would we as human beings respond when nightfall came for our generation once in that 2.5 millennia? So I think that, like, the really interesting for me science fiction is that science fiction that says, okay, let's take this one thing or these two things that are so natural to our world, and imagine if they were not there, how would human beings respond to that? And that shows us both, I think, the contingencies of the things that we take for granted in our world, a kind of Borges sense of, it's all basically classifying things in a different way of classifying things, and also tells us about how human beings might respond to these things.
You've mentioned so many books in this conversation. Only I've been making a little list, but I wanted to ask you like sort of two questions. One is, with your work on Strange Horizons, I'm just interested to know how, if at all, it's impacted how you read speculative fiction and how you write it, The Wall, and if there's anything in specific you sort of turned to when you were writing The Wall.
Yeah, Strange Horizons played a massive role. This is a weekly magazine that I'm the non-fiction editor of, big editorial collective, weekly science fiction magazine, which I've been with for now 4.5 years. It's played a massive role because before Strange Horizons, I think like most people growing up in Delhi, or say even Bangalore or Bombay in the 1990s, the science fiction we had access to was a very certain narrow kind. It was Arthur Clarke, Isaac Asimov, maybe Ursula Le Guin a bit of Roger Zelazny, Gene Wolfe, maybe Heinlein perhaps sometimes. That was it. So it was basically all white men of the 1960s, essentially. That was it, with a few exceptions thrown in. And then obviously you begin to think that is what science fiction is. It's a certain sensibility, a certain set of names that you always find in these books that, and then you begin to replicate that in your writing. So the first draft of this novel, which was 12 years ago, was completely influenced by all of that. And it was effectively much like those books, was very white, very male, and just like very 60s. It was an awful book, and I'm very glad that is not the book now. When I joined Strange Horizons, that was when I was exposed to the full range, plurality, diversity of the genre. And once I began to read all of that, and I read something like Yoss, the Cuban science fiction punk rock biochemist writer, you get a sense of how diverse the genre really is, and then you understand, okay, like there's a lot more to it, and it's time to unlearn stuff and relearn stuff. So that played a big role in my development as a writer. Just every week reading this very diverse like cast of characters. Who influenced this book? It's back to the 60s, but not Asimov. Ursula Le Guin was a massive influence on some of the ideas in this book. And just think her approach, which is an approach to the genre that tells a good story, but doesn't ignore the fundamental politics that underlies, our world, and the kind of class conflict that underlies so much of what we see around us, is for me like really like a map to how you should approach writing science fiction.
If anyone has any questions, you can send them in the chat box, in the Q&A box here, and we can get to them. And you want to give us all, I know, but you want to give us all an update on the sequel?
The sequel is in edits. The draft is all done. It's in the middle of edits, and my own hard deadline for finishing is the end of the year. So far, it's on track for that deadline, and then it'll be in the normal publishing queue. So I would imagine it will be out in the middle of next year. So I would guess like July, August of next year, I hope. So far, it's all on track for that. Yeah.
We have a couple of questions. One is, what's next? So I guess you've answered half of that. What's next after The Wall? Do you have any non-fiction in the works? One book at a time?
Not really. I'm still, I really want to like do more fiction. So I have a short story that's coming out in the Golanx anthology of science fiction, the second edition. So that's coming out next year. So that's one thing in the works. And once this series is done, and I've emotionally and mentally freed myself from the characters that I've kind of become really involved with over the last couple of years, I want to do another very different series that's more space opera kind. All these constraints about resources, to finally basically be a little more liberated and not have to always be wondering about self-pollinating crops and bone and iron alloys, and just do a much more kind of a grander kind of a work that's more space opera like. But so it's basically kind of a crossover between Ian M. Banks and, as always, Ursula Le Guin, because what fascinates me about Ian M. Banks' Culture series is that Ian M. Banks he imagines a post-capitalist, post-scarcity society, which I think again speaks to the ability of the genre to go beyond the structures that we live in. But then, instead of actually showing us the mechanics of that, he basically outsources that to AI. And then all his books are about the conflict that the culture has with non-culture societies, which are great fun to read, and it's wonderful, and I really love that series. But I've always thought that I'd love to see more about how this society, which has successfully overcome in space, in a space context, how that my society might actually resolve its own internal conflicts. So I want to think through some of those ideas in in my next fiction work. Non-fiction, I have no idea. Yeah.
Nayantara asks, there have been so many amazing book recs already, but I'd love to know what science fiction books or SFF books both of you would recommend.
You go first.
Oh dear. No, okay. So you mentioned Embassy Town actually, that was already one of my favorite science fiction books. I'm also a big fan of Ted Chiang's short stories. Exhalation is just one of my most favorite book collections. Yeah, go ahead.
I would, okay. So I recommend Yoon Ha Lee's Hexarchate series. It's called The Machineries of Empire. It's 3 books, and the first book is called Nine Fox Gambit. So yeah, like it's set in space, and yeah, it's just like some amazing imaginative work going on in that series. So that's one thing that I is one of my recent favorites. Then recently I just read so much like good stuff. Oh yeah, of course, how can I forget? Seth Dickinson's Traitor Barrow Covenant. I am just like I just like yeah, I mean that is a fantasy series that is set in a colonial context, and it does something that to me no other fantasy series does, is that it takes economy seriously. And in the very opening, you have somebody bringing down like an economy by printing fiat currency. I know it sounds boring, but the way Seth Dickinson does this is just fantastic. And it's kind of like, yeah, it's about empire, colonialism, and just like empire was based on like economic exploitation, he understands that, and it's all about economic warfare. So not your like usual sword and sorcery stuff, but or court intrigue, but like actually economic warfare between colonizer and colonized. The writing is fantastic. It also has the best slow burn romance like I've ever read. So I'm just like, that series is just like read it. It's so good. So Seth Dickinson's Traitor Barrow Covenant series and Yoon Ha Lee's Machineries of Empire are 2 recs. And I think always I want to like there's good Indian stuff coming out. This year, Samit Basu's Chosen Spirits, I think everyone here would know about. Lavanya Lakshmi Narayan's Analog Virtual was also very, very good. And of course, little couple of years before, Tashan Mehta's The Liar's Weave, was really good. And you're going to have like new stuff coming in, I think very soon from other Indian writers. So I would say that like, there's just like this presumption that Indians can't do genre fiction and can only do like lit fic. It's completely false. And just keep an eye out for like, some friends of mine have recently kind of, signed deals with agents and stuff. So it's in the works, and you'll have a lot more, I think, Indian SF in English coming out soon. So just like, I will of course tweet about that, but keep an eye out. Yeah.
Akanksha has asked, how did you have to reorient your approach to writing fiction after all the nonfiction you've been writing?
It was a massive unlearning because nonfiction, specifically legal writing, requires austerity of style, directness of approach, and to make things as bare-boned as possible, or at least that's my approach to legal writing. Basically demystify, right? Demystify everything. Fiction is the exact opposite, where the more, unless you're trying to be Hemingway, which I'm not, the whole idea is to be indirect, and to work through metaphor, image, and the whole like show don't tell is the first rule that they drill into us. And even now my editor literally has comments saying like too much telling ho raha hai, like so like it was so much like unlearning to just like not to do that, and of course to not make dialogue sound like written speech. I know that's still something I'm struggling with, and in book 1 that's still a critique people have. It's a very legitimate critique that a lot of at least few dialogue continue to sound as if they're written speech and not actually the way people talk. And so that's still like a continuing thing I'm dealing with. So yeah, like it requires a whole lot of unlearning to do to shift gears between nonfiction and fiction.
Simran asks, how long does it take you usually to write a novel? And do you write in the same space you work? Did you have to retreat to a special writing space to channel your thoughts? I'm quoting her. I used to think it was really pretentious when writers talk about taking fancy retreats to write, but I'm trying to rid myself of that prejudice by asking authors if they really do this.
See, how long is a difficult question to answer because there's only one novel so far. and that technically took 12 years, but not really because I wasn't doing it throughout. So I had a draft in college, which I know Akanksha is here, and she's read the very first draft of it in 2008. So she's seen like how it's evolved from like it's white male avatar to what it is now. So so then there was one draft. There was second draft when I was a couple of years later. Then when I began to when I was working, I just abandoned it for like 6 years and came back to it. So this was a kind of, I don't know yet how long it takes me. The second one has taken about a year, but then all the characters were there. So yeah, I mean, I don't yet know how much time it takes me to do one from scratch. I guess I'll find out when I begin the next one. Special places, I don't have that luxury right now because you just have to. I mean, so most of us can't live on writing. Like we have to have the day job and then the writing after that. And the moment you have like a day job, which for me for a while was practicing law, and recently has been like doing a PhD and continuing with some of the practice, you don't have the luxury then to like pick and choose your space or your time to write. You just have to ring fence like a certain amount of time every day, and wherever you are, like in a library, in a cafe, in a room, wherever, you just have to like tune out and do your work. So I do know people who have who do the retreat stuff, and I'm sure it helps, but I think most of us don't have that luxury to do that retreat stuff. Like we just have to mentally force ourselves to write wherever we are, and if you have like a free couple of hours to just get into the zone and just like do it and then get out and do whatever else you are doing. I think it's not that hard actually. I mean, once you get I had a legal writing prof once, who used to say, I think this applies across the board. He said that writing is like a muscle. The more you exercise it, the easier it becomes, and the less you exercise it, the harder it becomes. So if you're doing it every day, then it becomes, each day makes it easier to do it again the next day. When you stop doing it, getting back is harder and harder. So I think like, yeah, if you can just do like 3 hours every day, ensure that you're doing 3 hours every day, wherever you are in whatever space, it starts becoming easier to do.
Shivendu asks, are you a gardener or an architect when it comes to writing a novel?
Definitely architect. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we got that from this conversation. Ayush says, what are the chances of getting a speculative fic book selected by big publishers for publishing in India?
I would say that the scope is there right now because there is so little of it happening in novel form. And a lot of people are taking the other route, which is like the agent Western publishing house, and coming back to India via the West route. So, and that's a whole different discussion. I'll talk about it sometime another time. But I think that there is scope right now, simply because there is not much of it, and there's definitely like an interest among people, to actively seek out Indian science fiction fantasy writing. Not enough, I'd say, yet, because I think there's still a presumption, like I said, that Indians can only do lit fic, and it's only the whites, men or women, or non-binary people, or any, who can do like genre fiction. They have to be coming from the West. So until like the West validates them, it can't be. But I think it's not enough yet, but it's definitely there. So I'd say that scope is there, and it would probably still make sense in India to do it via an agent and then go through the agent and not directly do it. Although my case was a bit of an exception, but that's again a different story. But yeah, I think like a viable route is through if you want to publish in India, to an Indian publishing house and not take the route of an American agent, an American publishing house, then it would be better to first query an agent here and through them approach a publishing house. I think chances are good right now, honestly.
Which character on the wall is your ultimate personal favorite, which challenged you personally and where you had to invest a lot of your energy, emotions, imagination, and everything that it took to give birth to that character?
It's a really, really hard question to answer. I don't know how to answer that. Yeah, I mean, think the protagonist Mithila was actually the hardest to write because I think that like I did not want to give people an easy like hero. And there's a very sweet Goodreads review actually, which talked about how Mithila was a very annoying character, and I kind of like really associate with that because she is an annoying character. Uh, it's really it's kind of really hard to tread that line where a character is annoying, but nonetheless the reader is invested in what she's doing, and is so annoying that she just turns you off. And that was really hard to really hard to like tread that line. And honestly, like her previous iterations were way more annoying. And at one point, I was told that look, you're making your character so annoying that I mean, the obsessiveness to her thing with the wall is getting so grating that the readers will just not want to then be with her as she moves through the gears. So a lot of work had to be done to make her less annoying. I do think that it was the hardest character to write, and obviously the one I'm most attached to. Also, like the relationship she has with Rama was really challenging because as a heterosexual, like cisgender male author writing a queer relationship, there are like all kinds of pitfalls that are just waiting for you to fall into. And the answer there is sensitivity reads. So like you have to ensure that you sensitivity get your work sensitivity read by like people who can tell you that this is not working, or you're like you're doing this wrong, or try and change this. There was a scene now deleted, of course, where my reader just said one comment like this is so straight, it was savage. This was just completely savage. It was like chopped. The whole scene just went. So I was lucky to find readers who were willing to sensitivity read for this, and ultimately, I mean, I'm relieved that people have found that relationship like a convincing one, and yeah, but it was hard, like, and but I think it's worth it, honestly. I mean, given how diverse our world is, there's no reason why like you should only have like heterosexual relationships as pivots, right? Like they don't reflect the diversity of our world, so why shouldn't the world be?
Yeah, I guess that's a hard line to cross, but I think you did it pretty well in this book. I think I saw that Goodreads review. What do you think about your duology being made into a movie?
I would love it. I would love it, but that depends on who's interested yeah. So I think there is scope because it is a very visual novel, and I've been told by others it's a very visual novel. So I think there's good scope. So I would love it if somebody made it into a film or a series. But yeah, somebody has to have interest in that and want to put money into it.
Which character is most like you, Abhilash asked?
Yeah, I mean, so someone rightly said that the moment you write yourself into your characters, this is the quickest route to disaster. So so the answer is none, because like the moment you start putting yourself into characters, it just messes up the story you're telling. So yeah, there are mixtures of people I know, but none of them is me.
If there are any more questions, you can send them in. I actually had a question, which is how did you decide on a duology? Because I guess just lots of people are writing trilogies. So
yeah, no, I mean, so it wasn't even. It was supposed to actually get over in one book. It was supposed to be a standalone novel, but it just got out of control. So it just actually like the end of the first, what is presently the end of the first book, was supposed to kind of be around the 4/5 4/5 of the way through, and it was the last 1/5 that would follow from the events that happened at the end of the first book. But then it was just like, this is not doing justice to it, and so then I decided to make like the end of the first book half, and have a second half. So that's why a duology. So it wasn't it wasn't a cut down trilogy, but like an expanded standalone novel.
This is like a follow-up to the previous question. Why is putting a part of yourself into a character not good?
Yeah, because it's just like the point of writing is to communicate to your readers, right? And you communicate through universals. in a certain sense. Like you communicate like the plot, the characters, and the events and so on. Have to form a shared understanding between you and the reader. If you make your interiority, if you put your interiority into the novel, then it's no longer, it's very hard to then get that shared platform, because effectively it's just you that is in the novel, right? And no longer like that shared space. I don't know if I'm making sense, but basically what I'm saying is that putting yourself in then becomes it becomes like navel gazing, like you're looking in the mirror and kind of like, and you're not like writing for readers, then you're writing for yourself. So yeah, it's like, again, I think that like, again, if you have like references or in jokes like to things only you know, or like you and your like close friends know, it doesn't work in a novel, right? Uh, Genre in jokes do, because again, shared community. But that's the reason why, again, I wouldn't put like in jokes in, apart from like say one here or two there, just for like indulgence. But beyond that, it becomes like, something that drags down the novel, I think.
Okay, I think that was the last of the questions. So thank you so much, Gautam. That was a really lovely conversation.
Thank you for having me, and
looking forward to everything you write
soon.
Yeah, hopefully next year for the end of this duology, we'll see you in Champaca. I've put the link to purchase the book in the chat. You can find it on our website. And
don't use Amazon, use Champaca.
Thank you. Yeah. Actually, do you want to just quickly talk about why that was in your bio? The line about you're having as much space as a Kindle in the bookshop. I don't know why.
Oh, so I once went to Hay on Wye, which is like, I think 40 secondhand bookstores, and just as you enter Hay on Wye, there is a signboard that says, "In the kingdom of Hay on Wye, the Kindle is exiled." So it always struck me, because obviously like the Kindle is like so damaging to independent bookshops, right? Like it just like completely damages people going to the independent bookshop and like browsing and buying, which I think is an important part of our book culture. It's how I grew up. All my discoveries were just in Midland Bookshop in South Delhi, like just browsing as like a 10-year-old kid the shelves, and Kindle, like, is the antithesis of all of that. So I thought that, especially given Champaka, I thought like this is an appropriate thing to say.
Okay, thank you, Gautam, so much. And
Thank you so much.
And thank you everyone for attending.